Good evening, everyone. This is a Zoom lecture as well as a live lecture, so we will try to stay as close to 6 o'clock start. I think we're a little bit over, but I want to welcome everyone to, this is the last of the summer lecture series. And I hope you have enjoyed Gilded Age sports, from baseball to mahjong to coaching, and lots of sports that we never got to, like croquet, which started in Newport, and polo and tennis. And we will be debuting the theme of our next lecture series for this fall soon, so pay attention to the website, and we'll be sending out notices about that. But thank you all very much for being part of all of these. This is also the John Grenville Winslow Lecture. And did anybody know Mr. Winslow? Well, you know, he was a very special man in the life of the Preservation Society. He was on the board for a good deal of time, became the chairman of the board in the mid-1970s, served as the chairman of the board until 1989. And in his years as chairman, did many, many important things, taking the organization from a small one to a much larger one. But if you knew Mr. Winslow, you knew that his love was history. He really knew Newport history like nobody. I once had a tremendous opportunity to take a driving tour with Mr. Winslow, and what was so incredible, it took almost all day, and what was great was that he stopped at every single house and talked about the architecture of the house, the architect, the original owner, and then all successive owners, and he knew it all. So he really epitomizes what the Preservation Society is. A really wonderful man. And fortunately for us, a donor came forward and said, I'd like to underwrite an ongoing lecture series in his name as a tribute to him and for all of his achievements to the Preservation Society. So we will hold the John Grenville Winslow Lecture for many years to come. I think that Mr. Winslow would approve of tonight's speaker, Bob MacKay, because their interests are very similar, and actually their personalities are very similar too. For those of you who know Mr. Winslow, you'll see the same characteristics in Bob MacKay. Bob is a noted architectural historian. He's a historian in his own right on many topics. I'm going to go to my notes because I can't remember the titles of all of his books. But he got his degree from Boston University, his doctorate, in American and New England studies. His interest in sailing occurred when he sailed from the United States to England in 1968 as a member of Rudy Schaefer's crew aboard the replica of the schooner America. Can you imagine anything more beautiful? That must have been phenomenal. Would love to hear you talk about that. And he has a lot of books: America by the Yard, circuit camera images from early 20th century, Great Yachts of Long Island's North Shore, marine paintings from the New York Yacht Club, and he is the editor of Long Island Country Houses and Their Architects, 1860 to 1940, which is a phenomenal book if you're interested in the Gold Coast of Long Island. And then tonight, he is going to be talking about his new book, or from his new book, The Golden Age of Newport Yachting. You can get this online and from our museum store, and you will be able to buy it tonight, and Mr. MacKay will sign it. And this just came out, so we're very lucky to be one of the first audiences to hear your lecture. He is the former chairman of the board for historic preservation for the state of New York, so he has a preservation background that is next to none, and the director emeritus of Preservation Long Island. And finally, he is a member of the Preservation Society's International Council. 2 years ago, right before the pandemic, Bob arranged for a trip to Long Island. We saw the best sights in Long Island. He knows everything about the houses of Long Island, so you'll have to organize another one in the future, Bob. Bob has just had fusion back surgery, so I admire you and thank you for making the trip with his wife, Anna, from Long Island to Newport, and we're going to allow you to sit throughout the night, okay?
Thank you, Trudy.
And thank you so much for being with us, Bob. We love your support. Thank you all.
Let me say, now that we're on the theme of backs, that it's great to be back in Newport. And what I particularly remember about the summer of 1968 and sailing across the Atlantic on Rudy Schaefer's wonderful replica of the America is that we were well provisioned. Rudy had put 1.25 tons of his product on board. And you know, when you're having more than one, remember the Schaefer jingo. So we had a great time, and we're never thirsty. So, I'm going to start this talk on the golden age of Newport yachting, not in Newport, but in New York in 1844, because that is where it really did begin, when the New York Yacht Club is founded aboard a schooner, in the cabin of a schooner anchored off the Battery in New York. And before the meeting is over, someone said, well, what should we do next? And someone else said, well, let's sail to Newport. And so within a few days, they were away to Newport. And not long after arriving in Newport, 3 yachts come down from Boston, followed by the Boston press. And the Bostonians wanted trials of speed against the New Yorkers. They felt that their deep keel yachts were really superior to the centerboard yachts favored by the New Yorkers. A lot of shoals around New York Harbor. And the results of these trials of speed were rather inconclusive. And so there was, from the beginning, controversy. And there's nothing that yachtsmen love more, I think, than controversy, you know, unless it's excuses. The wind died, the tide changed, this kind of thing. So at first they come sporadically after that initial meeting. Then by the 1850s, the 2 fleets are meeting regularly every summer in Newport this very month. And it really builds after the Civil War. So our first slide is the wonderful 1872 Currier and Ives view of the squadron at Newport. And down below, you'll see that the first open amateur race was held in 1875 here in Newport by the Sewanaka Yacht Club of Long Island and New York. Sewanaka is an Algonquin word for Long Island. And they thought about where to do this first open amateur race. And they thought Newport, the perfect place, as the 2 fleets are there in August. And it's interesting to see how within these a few decades, yachting had really expanded, because the contestants for that race were from a whole series of different yacht clubs: the Atlantic Yacht Club of Brooklyn, the Boston Yacht Club, the Brooklyn Yacht Club, the Eastern Yacht Club of Marblehead, and New York and Sewanaka. And this would simply continue to build, and the interest in yachting and in racing was from this point on greatly leveraged by boosters. And there was no greater early booster of the pastime than James Gordon Bennett Jr., Jamie Bennett. He sailed into Newport at the age of 16 at the helm of his own 72-foot yacht. And I think I was here in Newport at 16, but I was cleaning the bottom of boats. I wasn't at the helm of my own 72-foot yacht. And as the Brooklyn Daily Eagle noted in 1870, he simply was the enthusiasm of every seaman in the American pleasure Navy. Bennett was always ready, as another observer said, to race anyone over any course for any amount And the slide we're seeing now is the first picture of the Boston and New York yachtsmen together. They're at a hotel near the entrance to Boston in this picture, but you see the red circle around a very young Jamie Bennett. And Jamie Bennett goes on to donate all sorts of trophies. He was incredibly generous in this regard. This is a picture of the Brenton Reef Challenge Cup of 1871. He goes on, I think, more importantly, to broaden the interest in Newport in the city by the sea by introducing other pastimes. And many of these yachtsmen were complete sportsmen. So in the upper right, you see Bennett's Westchester polo team. And right there, trying to hit that little ball is Bennett. He's leaning over his horse. And Herman Ulrichs is in there too, another great sportsman. He was a yachtsman. He participated in the defense of the America's Cup. And the Westchester team plays the first international match in polo here in 1880. And then Bennett goes on, of course, to create the Newport Casino right across from his own villa on Bellevue. And it would be the home of the U.S. Open for 34 years and until it moved down to New York about 1915. And the casino becomes the social center. It has that wonderful theater. So Bennett's contribution was huge. He broadens the interest of the city by the sea. Now he's followed by another huge booster of yachting, and that was Ogden Gillette. And Ogden did several things. First, he realized that there needed to be a connection for the summer colony and their yachts in the harbor. If you had taken a carriage down to the waterfront in the mid-1880s, you could easily have ended up being ensnarled in all the commerce going on down there, between fishmongers' carts and ship chandlers' wagons. And so he said a clubhouse is needed. And along with his much quieter older brother, Robert, they move ahead with this plan. They acquire Sayers Wharf in 2 transactions. It was actually Robert's name on the second transaction. And they build this very simple and utilitarian clubhouse with lots of porches so you could see your boat out there in the harbor at a distance. And what this really is the umbilical cord then between Bellevue and the harbor and Brenton Cove. And here are 2 pictures of that early clubhouse. And I particularly like the one from on top as we're looking out toward the water, because you can just see in the left-hand bottom corner the heads of launch drivers in their naphtha launches. And they're like Uber drivers, they're waiting for their owners to step on that dock, and boom, they're there, and out they go to the yachts. Of course, Mr. Gillette also presents these remarkable trophies valued at $500 for sloops and $1,000 for schooners, from 1882 until his death in 1897. And there's a year where there were no trophies, and then the Astors picked it up, and that contest continues to this day. And in the upper left, you see a picture from the exhibition of Gillette Cups that the New York Yacht Club staged during its sesquicentennial year a couple of years ago. And this was at the Redwood, and was a wonderful show. Alice Dickinson, the curator, did a tremendous job. And so the Gillette Cup is now a little different. While people had been putting up trophies, such as Jamie Bennett and the Newport Merchants, to attract yachtsmen for a number of years, what Gillette did here was create a series. He created a competition that you could count on, that you could come back for every year and plan around, and it becomes hugely popular. And the trophies, these magnificent trophies by Whiting Manufacturing and Tiffany, and are immediately picked up in the press, and they're their own advertising for the Gillette Cup regattas. And as you see, by 1893, the New York Times is calling it the blue ribbon of our aquatic contests, hugely important in the development of yachting. So when we get to this period between the wars, the 1920s and particularly in 30s, we're seeing the flowering of Newport afloat. And in the upper right, you see a picture of motor yachts, this one a yard down in Delaware, and it looks like a Ford assembly plant. I mean, they're coming off like a conveyor belt. And up in Bath, Maine, they were building these huge boats on spec. There seemed to be no end of interest in these great yachts. And of course, finally, the America's Cup arrives in Newport. It hadn't been raced for since 1920, but the problem really was Lipton. He preferred New York, and I certainly can see why he preferred New York, because the American headquarters for his tea company was right across the Hudson, and his name in big red letters ran right across the roof. And but finally, he doesn't have his druthers, and in 1930, the America's Cup moves to Newport, first of three contests here in that decade. And it made so much sense. Good sailors for a long time had said it ought to be raced off Newport because a wonderful protected harbor, and then Block Island Sound. Now, Block Island Sound might be a euphemism for the Atlantic Ocean, but it's a beautiful sheet of water for racing. And so those were great events. And then the Bermuda race, which had been started years before, finally figures out that Newport is the ideal venue for its start. They had tried starting the Bermuda race in all sorts of crazy places, but it arrives in 1936. And if there was a ground zero for this phenomenon in this era between the world wars, it certainly was the landing stage of the New York Yacht Club station down at Sayers Wharf. Now, by this point, the Yacht Club had built other stations at different places of interest, so it was called Station No. 6. But here you see this remarkable scene of stewards calling in the various launches as owners and guests come down to the landing stage and get in these launches. And look at these launches. The launches in this period were coupe launches. So if you were going to a fancy party, and certainly at night, everyone was in black tie, going to parties out on these floating palaces, you didn't want spray, and you would sit indoors. But here is this bustle of activity, and we thankfully the press covered it well. We have quite a few photographs of this phenomenon. What happened in 1915 is that George F. Baker of the Citibank He was chairman of the First National City Bank, which is what we know today as Citi. Rebuilds the Gillette building, broadens it. It's much bigger building. They can do a reception inside. And so here you see in the upper right, people waiting for their launches. They waited inside as well. And then you can see how we've gone from one little dock to 3 docks, and with a great central pier for the motor yachts that came in. And here is yachting attire in the 30s as the glitterati arrived to go out to various yachts. And here is Mr. Manville, the asbestos king. Of course, this is 50 years before asbestos. We knew other things about asbestos, but at this point, it's used by the American building industry in a big way. They produced 1,300 different products for builders. And down in the with the Countess Villa down below in the right picture, you see Grace Vanderbilt, Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt, and her family, her son and daughter-in-law, getting ready to head out to probably her husband's yacht. And then here are some damsels stepping aboard another one of these coupe launches in 1930. And so where were they headed? This is where they were headed. These incredible floating palaces that were out there filling the harbor beyond, even beyond Goat Island and the Cove. And what happens? What happens next? The war comes. And every single yacht that you were seeing here was taken by the government and sank during World War II, with the exception of Arthur Curtis James's Aloha, which he scrapped in '38. The motor yachts were used for convoy duty. They would slap racks of depth charges on the stern, put a few guns, deck guns on board, and they were really not built for the way commercial ships were. They had fewer bulkheads. They went down quickly and with tremendous loss of life. And all the boats that you see here were either torpedoed or they were involved in collisions before radar, or at least before the age of better radar. And so what happens then? Nothing happens for 20 years. And then there's the idea to begin the America's competition again, and to do it at Newport. And so we move on to 1958, and that is the sad-looking spectator fleet that we have after the war. And the press comes back to Newport, the press that had covered those 3 great America's Cup contests here in the 1930s, when Mike Vanderbilt grew up right here in this house, defended the cup, and they just couldn't believe it. Dunton from the Times thought Newport was making but a feeble attempt to replicate what he called the extravagant magnificence of the races of former years. And then the New York Yacht Club station, which had hummed with activity in 1937, with stewards calling out the arrival of the tenders, had been sold by the New York Yacht Club during the war and was now a marina and bar. And Mary Kremen from the Boston Globe had the courage to walk into the gin mill, and she wrote, where Vanderbilts and Astors sat with Ulrichs, waiting for launches to take them to their 300-foot yachts, there was now a jukebox. So the golden age, within just 2 decades, was suddenly as distant as the Jurassic Age. And so now we'll look at a few of the characters from this wonderful era between the wars. And the first one, I'm afraid, didn't even make it to between the wars. She was cut down by cancer in her 50s, very sadly. She was Harriet Warren Gillette. And let's start with her maiden name. She was the sister of Whitney Warren, the great architect, who did the Newport Country Club here, who did the New York Yacht Club's wonderful building on 44th Street in New York, and a few other small buildings in New York, like Grand Central Station. And she was married to Robert, who was the older brother, Ogden's older brother. And the two brothers, right at the end of the 18th century in the 1890s, commission almost identical steam yachts that are built in Scotland designed by G.L. Watson, the great naval architect. And very sadly, both brothers die in their 50s, and poor Ogden had only received his boat at, I think, Cowes weeks before his demise. And then 2 years later, the same thing happens with Robert. And the yachts bring the deceased back to Newport, and or they're met by their families at the dock as they arrive. Now, Harriet presses on and gets her captain's license. And the New York World, as you see, called her an expert in nautical affairs, capable of handling her own yacht in any water and in all water. And I think, frankly, better than virtually all the men that of this area we're going to see tonight. And we're going to see some house flags, or private signals, as they call. Her private signal that would be flown from the second mast of her steam yacht, Nama, is a wonderful one. I mean, Harriet was a fierce swan sailing the blue seas of the world, and she did so in this wonderful yacht after her husband died. Here is an interior. The interiors were incredible, done by a crew of 25 from Nelson of Paris. And after her husband's death in 1899, she loses her daughter, seen here in the wonderful Sargent painting in 1902. There is a son, but he's in his 20s, and she heads to sea to find her solace. This is a picture of her yacht, of the yacht that Robert and Harriet had built in Newport. I think it may have been taken when they brought his body back from the Mediterranean. And off her stern, you'll see the officers' cottages on Goat Island, and to the right, Trinity Church. And the crew of the Nama met her at the dock and carried the coffin up to Trinity. That sad time. So this is what Harriet does. She visits all of these places, and this is just a partial list in the years between 1901 and 1912. And you can imagine that on trips like this, there were some incidents. And so as she steamed into Venice in 1906, she turns the helm of Nama over to a pilot, an Italian pilot, who promptly runs the yacht into this old ironclad, Italian ironclad that was anchored off Venice. And she realizes that there was damage and that this would become an international incident. So he was angry, but she paid for the damages. And then in 1909, she's on her way to the Dardanelles. And as she approaches one of the Turkish guard forts, fires around over her bow. They decided that Nama was really a warship because she had a couple of signal cannons, and they had to come to anchor for a number of days. And this does become an international incident, hits the papers all over the world, and Harriet says, it is done on purpose just to be disagreeable. And of course, the bad guy was the Sultan. But the Sultan was no match for Harriet, and he is forced to back down. She missed a dinner engagement in Constantinople, so she was not pleased on arriving finally at the dock there. But the Sultan sends a court officer down with something called the Grand Cordon of Checkapat. And I think he must have taken it off his uniform. You know, he has so many. And so that was the end of that incident. Amazingly, she develops a close friendship with the Kaiser. The Kaiser was a true yachtsman, and it's a shame that he didn't stick to yachting, of course. But in those years, until her death in 1912, she would be at all the great race weeks and always at Kiel Race Week, I think all but maybe 1 year. And the Kaiser thought her yacht was the finest that he had ever seen. I don't think he was too happy with the Imperial yacht, the Hohenzollern, which had actually been built as a warship. And then the German people said, oh, but the Kaiser has to have a yacht. So they converted it into being a yacht. But there you see a picture of the formal dining room. And so she would visit, and the Kaiser and Kaiserina would have her for lunch or dinner, and then they would go over to Nama. And here is an incredible picture of Harriet and the Kaiser, upper left, and their crews. Look at the extent of these crews. There is a upper right, a red circle around the Kaiser and his crew, and then underneath you see his ensign. And there is Harriet sitting in the second row of her crew aboard Nama. She is back in Newport. Of course, Robert Galetz had a cottage here, a wonderful McKim Mead and White one, in the summer of 1911. And she is invited by the Secretary of the Navy to take a ride on one of these early submarines. And she and Alice Roosevelt, TR's daughter, become among the first submariners, women submariners. I also ran into an account of her going up in a hot air balloon. You didn't want to be in competition with her at the Newport Art Show. Harriet Galette was really something. It's sad, quite amazing what happens to these yachts after they passed out of the hands of the Galettes. Of course, Ogden's yacht, the Mayflower, becomes the presidential yacht. And here we see on the upper picture, the buzzards that got to use Mr. Galette's beautiful yacht for right up until through Coolidge. And amazingly, Nama is purchased by a British adventurer, renamed the Istar, and she becomes the flagship of the rum fleet. She makes 6 or 7 trips across the Atlantic, loaded with the hooch that Hartwell was producing. His signature is right on the label there of every bottle he made. And she's off the Virginia Cape, she's off New York Harbor, she's out here off Montauk. And the head of Prohibition, they call him head of the Dry Patrol in New York, goes out on a patrol boat to see what's going on one day when she's off New York. And she's beyond the 12-mile limit. He can't do anything, but he sees some people on deck. And he yells up, "What's your cargo?" And a voice on deck says lemonade. So there, now, our next figure from this wonderful era is the Ocean State Senator, Jesse Metcalf. Now, Jesse Metcalf, of course, from the Providence mill owning and publishing family, and a great family for philanthropy as well. He really had two careers. One as a mill owner, and one as a politician. And he went to Washington like no other congressman ever had before on his own yacht. The Washington press corps loved this, and he would live on that yacht as long as he could, about 9 months of the year until he had to move into an apartment. And you know how bad Washington is in the summer, even now, how hot. Imagine how hot it must have been today. Before air conditioning, just impossible. But he had a way to beat the heat. He would have his crew at night steam down the river with all the portholes open, so air would pass through the Felicia's cabins, and then they would return in time in the morning for the senator to take a car to the Capitol. Now, while he was enjoying this lifestyle down in Washington, there was trouble back up here in Rhode Island, Prohibition, and the 18th Amendment, and it really got, frankly, quite dangerous out on the water. Even Arthur Curtis James on the magnificent bark Aloha thought he had been fired on in a hot pursuit one day. But there were two famous cases in 1929. The first was the Idle Hour, and you see an old picture of the Idle Hour in the upper right, a rum runner. She's being chased by the Coast Guard in a hot pursuit. They're chasing her up the Sakonnet, and as they go by Fogland Point, firing at the Idle Hour, bullets penetrate the windows of Mr. W.B. Freeman's cottage at Fogland Point. And Mr. Freeman is really angry. And so he storms into the Providence office of the senator the next day and said, "This has got to stop, where this is endangering my property and the lives of my family." And then came, a few months later in December, the famous Black Duck episode where the Coast Guard opened fire even without warning, and the senator breaks with his party and begins to change his mind about prohibition. And so in 1930, he says, "For years, maritime laws have provided that vessels being stopped on suspicion must be warned before being fired upon." And he comes out strongly against prohibition, and his timing was perfect. Public opinion was changing, and he was reelected in the fall. We're going to move on now to another lady. I don't think she is quite a Harriet, but she has grown on me, and that's Eleanor Elkins Widener. The Wideners were a family that did things together. Old P.A.B. Widener had parlayed a chain of butcher shops into a traction empire, and then became an investor in a lot of major American industries. And his family, his sons and their wives and grandchildren, all lived together at his incredible house, Linwood Hall, down in Elkins, PA, and his art collection there as well. And they all enjoyed the family yacht, the Josephine, named for Mrs. Widener. And I've never seen this before with one of these yachts of this era. It was registered not only in his name, but the name of all the sons. And unfortunately, one of the industries that Widener had invested in was the parent company of the White Star line. And so here we see his private signal, his house flag that would fly from that second mast of the steam yacht. And look what he did. He borrowed the White Star from the private signal, from the White Star line, and uses it on his private signal. And of course, the Titanic is one of the White Star ships. And so PAB's son George and Eleanor and their son Harry Widener, recent graduate of Harvard and a great bibliophile, are on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. And as she was cutting through those ice fields at 23 knots, they host a dinner party in the first class dining room. That's the picture lower right. Captain Smith was at the dinner party. And of course, not long after the ship hits the iceberg, Eleanor thought it was just a slight shudder. She didn't think the ship was going to sink. And as she got in the lifeboat, her husband and son waved goodbye. And through that terrible night, not knowing if they were going to be saved in the lifeboat, when the sailors at the oars tired, she took one of the oars and helped row boat No. 4 through the night. This tragedy was the end of PAB Widener. Here's a poker chip from the Josephine, a memory of all the fun that the family had on board. The Josephine never left her dock again. He never set foot on her, and he died of a broken heart a few years later. She, however, as you know, went on to give Harvard its great Widener Library in 1915 in memory of her son. She completes Miramar, her villa here in 1915 that she had planned with George, with her second husband, who was Dr. Alexander Rice, the South American explorer. And here he is pointing at the Amazon basin. Together they build the yacht you see in the upper right-hand corner. And in the 1920s, she goes further up the Amazon than any woman had ever gone, any white woman. And at one point they're attacked. These women weren't the silly triumvirate ladies. These women were, I think, really impressive. Now we're going to move on to the Edie Morgan and the cottages that were built by these yachtsmen. Now, by 1912, 58 of these cottages, really just about all the major villas were owned by members of the New York Yacht Club. And this is just, and there were yachtsmen from Boston and Philadelphia as well. This had a great deal to do with the fact that Newport became a cottage and villa community as opposed to Saratoga Springs, New York, which it always was being compared with in the 19th century. Saratoga remains a hotel town, not Newport. And I think my favorite house owned by this long list of yachtsmen was Beacon Rock. Beacon Rock is called by architectural historians the Acropolis of Newport. It's certainly an iconic McKim-Meaden White house. But I'm not sure that E.D. Morgan, a great sportsman who really loved boats, one yachting historian said he would buy yachts the way most people would buy a paper at a newsstand. And he had so many, they called his fleet Morgan's Navy. And so what you're seeing here in this old postcard of his remarkable house in the red circle is his steam yacht May, and then in the lower left, there is a picture from the water looking back at May. He had a great cleat put into the rock, and he ran a cable out to May, and he had a hose running along the cable. So May was supplied by water and gosh knows what else from ashore. Of course, he builds this stone bridge out to the rock. This is, I think, really more of a boathouse or a giant boat pier. And if we look down from the house into the cove on the other side, it gets even more amazing. In the upper left, you see the bones of a British bark called the Bessie Rogers that sailed in here in 1872 and was in bad weather and was rammed and sank and became a navigational hazard. So somehow they got the pig iron she was carrying off of her, and they brought the bones up into the cove below Beacon Rock. And E.D. Morgan goes down at low tide, sees that there's water in the hole, and said, "This could be my boat well." And he builds a walk around the inside. He has his launches inside, roofs over the thing, has many of the crew on his yachts living down there. You see a dock in the middle picture on the outside. And then in the third picture is a picture of the Bessie Rogers boathouse here at night with electric lights, and apparently even entertain down there. Isn't it wonderful how you can do just about all of Newport history with postcards? So now here's a picture, recently discovered picture, and we're looking across the little cove here, and we see another boat. He had, on the other side, he had Javelin, his flyer, which was a Herreshow flyer, which could move along at great speed. And what these yachtsmen also did was bring Newport closer. So in 1881, W.H. Osgood did the trip from Newport to New York in just 10 hours, had breakfast here and dinner in New York, and nobody could believe it. By 1906, W.K. Vanderbilt, with Tarantula, cut it to 6 hours, and then in 1911, Peter Rouse on Winchester 2 down to 5 hours, and I think some of the commuting yachts in the 30s even shaved more time off of that. Saratoga Springs never got any closer to New York. Newport did. And even if you didn't own a yacht, you often chartered it. So Ogden Mills' parents would charter a steam yacht to come up for the summer. Another amazing figure, Sadie Jones. Sadie learned how to entertain early in life because her father was a congressman, and she followed him to Washington and handled his entertaining. She was married to Pembroke Jones and another North Carolinian, and Pembroke had a rice milling business, and they lived in Wilmington, North Carolina. Well, Henry Walters from of course, it's the Walters Gallery family, railroad owning family, is sent by his father at the end of the 19th century down to run the family's Atlantic coast line, which was headquartered in Wilmington, and he gets typhoid. And the Joneses very nicely take him in, nurse him back to health. And Henry never moves out. And a few years later, when Henry is called back to New York, the Joneses follow him to New York. And Henry taught the Joneses a great deal about New York society and how to break into it. And look at their private signals. Now, who copied who? Amazing. So people began to call her the woman with two husbands. And also, since she was a great entertainer, as we're about to see, keeping up with the Joneses, although the expression was around before Pembroke and Sadie, certainly was further popularized by them. This was the scene at Newport. Sherwood was their Bellevue house, the Newport's White House, it's often called. And Elizabeth Lair said it best. She said, their table groaned under the weight of rare Southern delicacies. No one in Newport could produce mint juleps to equal hers. And then, they would entertain there, a ball there, and also on board Narada, which was owned by Walters. And the accounts of these parties are truly amazing. A dinner for 36 at a table on deck with a 10-foot floral model of Narada on a lake bordered by aquatic foliage and night-blooming water lilies, which also appeared in the guests' finger bowls. Even the yacht's burgee and private signal were depicted in bloom. And there you see Narada just off the Lime Rock light with Fort Adams in the background. And this was, talking about social advantage and the great competition that went on here in the Gilded Age. Well, it would be one thing if you could have a ball at your house. It would be another thing if you could do that and then the following week have 36 for an intimate dinner on your floating palace in the harbor. Here they are together just about, I think about in World War I. Pembroke dies in 1919. And New York Society thought this was too much because back in New York, Sadie was living in the same house with Walters, so Walters had to move out to a hotel for a while, but they are married in 1922, announcing the same from their cabin aboard the Aquitania, and they steam off into the night and the eternal speculation about Newport's menage a trois. Now, we could talk about entertaining afloat forever. Let me just say that the greatest stunt ever pulled, I think, was Eleanor Robeson Belmont, August Belmont Jr.'s wife. Nobody liked him, everybody liked her. And she helped orchestrate a garden party, bringing in 1912 Houdini up to Newport. And we don't have a picture of Houdini in Newport, but we have a picture of Houdini doing his famous overboard box escape trip in New York the same year. That's what you're seeing on the right screen. And he did it from the stern of Scout, their boat, and with J.P. Morgan and the German ambassador at the lawn party gasping as he came to the surface. Certainly a family often here, and so I've always wondered why they didn't have a villa, but was the Morgans, and this was a family long associated with the New York Yacht Club. This is between the wars. This was the second JP, Jack Morgan. Here he is with his son, Junius, and his father had been a Commodore of the New York Yacht Club. He had his two sons, his son-in-law, and they had, of course, as you all know, a series of wonderful yachts, steam and yachts and motor called Corsair, and this is the last one. This is a huge yacht, 343.5 overall. It drew 18 feet. The only problem was their timing was bad. It was launched in 1930, about 6 months after the great stock crash, and so they played down the launching. They went up to the Bath Iron Works in private railroad cars, but did not put on the kind of party that they might have a year earlier. And Junius takes the boat on a cruise up into Penobscot Bay, and as they're entering Gilkey Harbor, the helmsman misses a mark, and this is what happens. That huge yacht ends up on a rock ledge. And from these pictures, if she drew 18 feet, she's probably 14 feet out of the water. The New York papers are bugling that the boat's going to break up this $2.5 million yacht. Imagine what it would be in today's terms. And this is exactly how the Corsair ended up after the war. She was converted to a cruise ship. She runs up on a ledge off Acapulco. And that's the end of her. The Mexicans did get her power plant ashore, where it probably is still producing power for portions of Acapulco. But that was the end of Corsair. Takes luckily at high tide with 2 tugs and the Coast Guard icebreaker Kickapoo, they get her off, and she gets to Newport in time for the America's Cup. That was always the plan. And the imagery of the America's Cup from the 1890s, at least, right up to World War II, you always see Corsair in the background at the finish. The family had such a major role in that competition. Okay, summer of 1935. Howard Hughes, I know you all associate Howard with aviation, but he actually owned some yachts. This was the biggest, 320 feet. He steams in 1935. The harbor's crowded. Doesn't see a place where he can anchor. So where does he anchor? Right in the middle of the channel going into Newport. Can you all guess what happened next? In the middle of the night, the Fall River Line Commonwealth, over 400 feet, steams in, just misses Southern Cross, hits the underwater bank of the channel, and the captain thinks damage may be done. They do get to the pier, and the next day, the harbor master and Fall River Line officials go out to Hughes's yacht, and the captain is very apologetic, and the harbor master asks him to move the yacht, and the captain said, "I can't do it without Mr. Hughes's permission," and he's gone ashore to see Mr. Hartford. Of course, that was even more worthless. Huntington Hartford, who was a buddy of his from California, among other places. So finally, Hughes comes out and he says, "Well, you're not used to a big yacht like this in Newport." Harbor master runs down the list of major yachts, Corsair and the rest of them, and Hughes finally moves the yacht to the other side of Goat Island. Now, I know when we get to questions and answers, you're all going to want to know just who Howard was with in the summer of 1935. As the kids say, who was his squeeze? Well, now this took a lot of research, but it appears to have been after Billy Dove, and it was Hepburn, and before all the rest, and this is just a partial list. However, there was one lady aboard Southern Cross that had she ever met Howard, I don't think she would have given him the time of day, and that was Elsie MacKay, the actress and aviatrix. Her stage name was Poppy Wyndham, and the year after Lindbergh flew across the ocean, she decided to do it in the other direction, a much harder feat to fly from east to west, and was never heard from again. One of her tires washed up on an Irish beach about 6 months after the flight. And her father, who was head of the huge P&O shipping lines, as Harriet had done, sought his solace at sea, had the Southern Cross built, and her bowsprit, as you can see in that blue circle, was a absolutely wonderful spitting image of Elsie. Okay, we're on to the last few here. Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was both a commodore and a brigadier general, and he was an absolute stickler for yachting etiquette and so known for it between the wars. Here we see him early in his career, and before World War I, his career as a yachtsman. He would, when he arrived at the dock, he would take off the straw hats that he liked to wear. He'd put on his yachting cap, and then the launchman would salute him, and he would always step aboard the launch before anybody else. And then when he got out to his yacht, in this era was North Star steam yacht, the whole crew of his yacht would be lined up, and the captain and they go through the same saluting. Here we see his wife, one of the marrying Wilson girls, and of course, as you all know, he was disowned for marrying the wrong woman, and such a sad thing because he was very accomplished, and this was one Vanderbilt marriage that lasted. By the 1930s, he is really without means, and at least to maintain his lifestyle. And it's costing him, according to his son, $7,000 a month to keep his last great yacht, the Winchester, at the dock down in Florida, and he at the boat basin during the winter. And so he's dependent on his difficult mother and his sisters to help him put up some money from time to time to put the yacht into commission. And as you can see, he's the fifth owner. First thing that happens after he buys the Winchester, he's anchored off the New York Yacht Club station in the East River, and a fuel tank explodes, and the smoke goes so high it's seen from both the Chrysler and Channon towers. But he took this yachting etiquette to a new level during this period. It was popular, and still is, for people from Newport and in New York to go to the Harvard-Yale boat races every year and every spring down in New London. And so down he went one year in the 30s, and he is anchored near Normal Hole, Vincent Astor's last huge yacht, and Vincent's is a relative and great friend of FDR's, and FDR was aboard, and FDR looks over the railing when a tide change brings the stern of the Winchester and Normal Hall together, and recognizes it's the Vanderbilts, and FDR invites them on board Normal Hall, and Neely gets up and tells the president that he has no business inviting guests on board a yacht. Only the owner of the yacht can do it. So Vincent Astor comes along a few minutes later, extends the invitation. But in this moment, after telling the President of the United States he could not do that, Grace Vanderbilt, and they call her around Newport Queen, or her Grace, is observing this. She gets up from her deck chair and walks to the rail after the president had been told off, and she said, "I don't like you, Mr. President." Then she doubles down, "I don't like you at all." And FDR said, "Well, Mrs. Vanderbilt, lots of people don't like me. You're in good company." Well, they go over there, and then of course, FDR could turn on the charm. And when she leaves, she tells them that while she's not going to vote for him, she won't vote against him. So that was the end of that one. High Esmero, we'll go through this very quickly. This was many thought the most beautiful yacht during this period in Newport, and here the Manvilles were often here, did a lot of entertaining. High Esmero, the family's initials all put together. We talked about most of those yachts going to the bottom very quickly. High Esmero, renamed the USS Niagara, becomes a tender for PT boats, and she is at Guadalcanal and Tulagi during that terrible struggle. And in April of 1943, the Japanese send 177 planes to strike the two islands. She is up a river at Milani and amazingly knocks down 6 Japanese fighters who were coming over at 150 feet. The people on deck could see the faces of the pilots. A month later, she's on her way to New Guinea, when her luck runs out, a formation of Japanese bombers come along doing a pattern bombing. 500-pound bomb goes through her forecastle, and there are tanks of gas all over the deck for the PT boats. It's amazing she just didn't totally blow up. And what you're seeing here, and I don't know if the Japanese took this picture or if we took it, it's an amazing picture. These are the PT boats going back to assist her, and they got everybody off. Amazing. Okay, our last profile, Tommy Sopwith, or Tommy Sopwith. T-O-M Sopwith, they called him Tommy, but the initials stood for Thomas Octave Murdoch Sopwith. And as Prince Philip said, he was British aviation, and he figured in the development of warplanes for all of Britain's wars of the 20th century. And of course, he would challenge twice for the America's Cup in the 30s. And he was probably best known for his World War I fighter named the Sopwith Camel. Britain built over 2,400 of these warplanes, and they opposed the planes built by the brilliant Dutch engineer and plane manufacturer Anthony Fokker. Fokker had been sent to Berlin before the war by his father to learn how to be an auto mechanic, gets into airplanes, starts his own factory, and he developed the triplane that the Germans had such success with, and the Red Baron flew. He later, after the war, is able to get his factory out of Germany. He continues to make planes in Europe and later the United States, very good planes. So here's our last slide. It's the 1934 America's Cup. And Sopwith turned up with a faster boat. And he is leading 2 races to none. And in the 3rd race, he's ahead. And Mike Vanderbilt, one of the few times the man was ever discouraged, thinks all is lost, turns the helm over to his tactician and goes below. And the tactician, wily old Sherman Hoyt, fools Sopwith into taking a couple of unnecessary covering tacks, ekes out a little lead and wins. They win that race. And then the 4th race comes. And in the 4th race, Mike fouls Sopwith at the start. Really he should have been thrown out of the race. But Sopwith doesn't put up his protest flag right away, which is the rule, and doesn't inform the committee that he's protesting until the end of the race. The committee says disallows it. So Sopwith, who was a laconic fellow, man of very few words, is on the way in very deep in thought, and up pulls a launch, almost touching the stern of Endeavour, and a very tall man at the helm. And he looks across at Sopwith and he said, "You Sopwith?" And Sopwith nodded, and the tall fellow says, "I am Fokker." And here, these 2 titans of 20th century aviation are meeting for the first time over a little patch of Narragansett Bay. And everybody on Endeavour, everybody in the launch, absolutely quiet. And finally, Tommy Sopwith breaks the silence. And this is what he said: "Christ, come aboard and have a drink," which is what we all should do right now. Thank you very much.
Bob, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Now I want to open it up to our audience. We have time for a few questions, and I'll just pass you the mic so you can let the people at Zoom hear your lovely voice.
Well, we'll do this over a drink. Oh, there's one question. I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on how the coronet, which is being restored down on the waterfront, fit into this picture.
Coronet is of course much earlier, winner of the 1885 transatlantic race, and if I may share one story with you, could I talk for a little longer? She passes active right up till about, I think it was 1904, and when she is sold to an evangelical group that maintained her for many, many years, she was in a terrifically bad condition in her last years, and I think you all know she was taken by Iris at that time, and brought down here, and it's really not a restoration but a rebuilding that's going on now. But the last private owner, Coronet, was my great-great-uncle, and I was on the crew that brought her down, and it was quite an experience. We had kerosene, tanks of kerosene all over the deck, running the big dock pumps, and a crash boat behind us. We wondered if we were ever going to get to Newport. And the water was brown for the first hour, really all the way from Gloucester down to the canal, because it was pulling the rust off the loose ballast. She was so old, she came from the age of loose ballast, not lead keels or iron keels. And but we did make it. And when we picked up the boat, there was an old man on deck, and he came over, and he was introduced as the man who had been the captain of this boat for the Kingdom, the evangelical group, for many, many, many years. And he said, "Are you so-and-so's great nephew?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "My parents were on the delivery crew that picked this boat up from your great-great-uncle in 1904. So that's my coronet story.
Any other questions? Well, I think they're ready just to chat with you over a drink. So I will let you know he's going to go straight over to the book table over here to sign some books, and you can pick up the book too if you don't have one yet. And then down below, you'll find yourself the bar for refreshments, and make yourself at home. Thank you.